Um, this is harder than I thought. When Libby invited me to participate and tell my story, I thought, oh, sure, I'll do that. And then I kind of realized that it's hard to encapsulate 75 years into a short talk. So I'm just going to talk to you about my life. And the way I wanted to frame it is a way that a favorite author of mine frames it. And this is Catherine Bateson. I don't know who knows her, but she's Margaret Mead's daughter. And about 20 years ago, she wrote a book called Composing a Life. And she used the metaphor of weaving, looking at the diverse strands of our lives and how unique they are. Some similar experiences, certainly, but some very unique experiences as well. And putting those all together in what she calls a tapestry. So we're all weaving our own tapestry. So I'm kind of going to use that metaphor as I go through. And I've chosen three rather big chunks of the tapestry to talk about, but there are many others, of course. I'm going to start with family in my early life, and then move on to work and career. And then I want to talk about my religious journey as well, and how I found my ministry at First Unitarian Church. So here we go. My family for several generations was born, raised in Southern Ohio, a very small town at the very south, the point of Ohio, if you know what that looks like, right on the Ohio River. And indeed, I was born and raised there. I don't think that you could have found any two people who are more different from each other than my mom and my dad. I'll start with my dad. He's from a poor farm family in Southern Ohio. By the way, Southern Ohio is the northernmost part of Appalachia, so that gives you an idea of what this environment was like. My dad was the eldest of 7 children. His father only had a 3rd grade education, but my father was very, very smart, and he ended up being double promoted twice and graduated high school at age 15, wanted to go to college to become an engineer, and his parents said, no way, you are going to go out and work and earn money for the family, to support the family, which he did. So that was my dad, kind of a hardscrabble existence at the beginning of his life. Got more affluent, not too, but a little bit more as life went on. He got a job as a purchasing agent at a company where he worked for many decades until they laid him off with no pension at age 63. Then there was my mom. She was an only child, so she had no idea what it could be like to grow up in a big family like my dad did. But she was alternately wealthy as a child and not wealthy, because there was all kinds of ups and downs in her father's life. He was, it's been rumored, some kind of a gambler, and sometimes he made money and sometimes he lost money. But she grew up in a big, nice house and had champagne tastes. And so the two of them were married for almost 60 years. And myself, I was born in 1945, my sister in 1950. Yeah, I could say champagne tastes on a beer budget. There was always a shadow of debt hanging over the family. We certainly were not wealthy. We did not take vacations when I was a child. But we were rich, you know, in the things that really mattered. My mother had grown up with, you know, classical music and books everywhere, and we went to concerts. We went to historical sites on Sunday drives, even though we couldn't take long vacations. And we had great conversations. We talked about books. We talked about other people, of course, our relatives. But basically, we were encouraged to work hard in school, to study. Neither of my parents, as I had indicated before about my dad, my mom didn't go to college either. She was married at the age of 19. So they wanted us to excel and to succeed in a way that they felt perhaps they hadn't. Well, those of you who grew up in the 1950s, that post-war era, you know that that was an era of expansion and opportunity, and we had a pretty normative middle-class life, considering that we didn't have money. You know, we had enough money for the piano lessons, the ballet lessons, the you know, all the things that a middle-class childhood would have back in that era. I don't know. We moved to Tennessee when I was a junior in high school. But that was tough. That was a tough move for us. But it was another mountain, small community in East Tennessee. My father's job took him there. That was before he got laid off. It was a totally different experience in some ways, but it was very similar in other ways. Not sophisticated environment. You know, my mother and father sort of shone because they were smart and you know, had kind of different interests from the ordinary person on the street there. But it was fine. I just moved in. I had band just like I had in Ohio, and I had my band friends, and we took trips and all this good stuff. So it came time for me to go to college. Where was I going to go? Well, I was going to go back to a small place in Ohio, or maybe I was going to go to a small place in Kentucky. This was my mother's idea. But for me, I wanted to reach a bit farther. So I did. And I had decided that I was going to apply to what they used to call the Seven Sisters, one of the Seven Sisters schools. Because at that time, none of the Ivy League schools admitted women, and this was my chance to get an elite education. I knew nothing about any of these schools. So by accident, there was an issue of Look magazine that I saw at the dentist's office. And the cover story was, Wellesley girls, you know, make it big, or, you know, they have a wonderful life and look what they do, and they study, but really they meet men and they do all this other cool stuff in a beautiful setting. And I said, okay, Wellesley College, that's for me. So I came back, I said to my mother, I'm going to go to Wellesley College. She goes, what? We can't afford that. And, you know, don't be ridiculous. And I said, well, you know, there's financial aid. See, I know there's such a thing as a financial aid for women. So I don't know, we kind of messed around a while, and finally, yes, I applied there as well as to the small schools. And I got in with a full financial aid package. So that was really gratifying. And I was on my way to a very, very new phase in my life. My father always joked when people remarked that I was going to Wellesley, which is outside of Boston, in case people don't know where it is. He always said, yeah, it's the cheapest place we could have sent her. So they thought that was quite funny. I'm going to backtrack just a minute and tell you another thing about my mother that I think is really important. Unusually for women of that era, middle-class women anyway, she worked not just to help with family finances, but because she loved working. She loved working outside the home. We always had child care from a great aunt who took care of us. But one of the jobs that she had once we moved to Tennessee was a job driving the bookmobile. She worked for the county library, and she drove it on these mountain roads to these small mountain communities where people could, you know, check out books. This was their library. And it's so hard for me to think about that now, because I just took it for granted then. And I went on one trip with her, and it was like, oh my God, these roads are horrible. But now that I think about it, you know, she was really a role model for me of a strong, independent woman. And that was so important in shaping my interests and my career as well. So, all right, so what I do in September of 1963, I get on a Trailways bus. And I had never been to New England. I had never been to Boston. I had never been really to any big city other than Cincinnati, Ohio. So this was a shock to me. And when it was a 1,000-mile bus ride, I had to change Port Authority in New York City, which was extremely frightening to this small town girl. Got to Wellesley, and indeed, it was quite a culture shock. Girls who were, well, who were women, young women, who were wealthy, who had traveled all over the world, whose fathers were ambassadors and lawyers and judges and, you know, cardiac surgeons, and it was a new world for me. But it wasn't just that. What was really amazing to me was the emphasis on women's empowerment and strength, and the power of those bonds of friendship among women. So that was big. You know, a woman president of the college, women organized everything. Many of the professors were women, although we had many men as well. And those bonds are bonds that I've kept my entire life, and dear friends from my college days. And I actually have continued my Wellesley connections here in Rochester. I was president of the Rochester Wellesley Club. I've done, you know, fundraising for the college, reunions, et cetera, et cetera. I planned one of the reunions, wrote the reunion book one year. So it's a theme in my life, and it's a very important 4 years at looms, very large in my experience. So, and of course, during my junior year, I had a blind date with a tall, handsome man from MIT, majoring in electrical engineering. I was an English major, and my initial thought was, no way, you know, I don't want a blind date with an electrical engineer. But as it turned out, he became my husband, now 53 years. We had a lot in common. We both come from more modest means and had kind of, you know, scrambled our way up into these elite institutions. So we did have a lot in common, and it was a true blind date because we went to Gilbert and Sullivan performance at MIT, and we got to the performance, and we're waiting, and the curtain opens, and surreptitiously I pull my glasses out of my purse, and he surreptitiously pulls his glasses out of his pocket, and we put them on. So we both were nearsighted, but we laugh about that being our blind date. We didn't want to admit that when we first met each other. So let's see. So from there, he was getting his PhD. We married in 1967, right after I graduated from Wellesley. He was getting a PhD at MIT, moving on from his bachelor's degree. And I got a master's degree in English teaching from Harvard. At the time, we lived in Cambridge for 3 years. And that was my first fail as a career, was English teaching in high school. I don't know how many of you have done that, but it's probably the hardest thing I have ever tried to do. And disciplining large 18-year-old boys who would rather be doing anything than reading Shakespeare was not anything that I was very good at least at the time. So quit doing that. But about that time, we ended up moving to Fort Collins, Colorado, where we spent 10 wonderful years. My husband was a professor at Colorado State. And I actually got another master's degree at Colorado State in counseling, and worked as a high school guidance counselor at a school outside of Denver. These were the days, well, when women sort of trailed their husbands' jobs, you know, and that certainly was the case with me. I was, as they used to call us, the trailing spouse. And it seemed okay. I had to forge my opportunities by the opportunities that he was given. So as I look back on it, I see that that was a challenge that I had throughout much of my early life. So let's see. So we're in Colorado. I've got the degree. I've been a guidance counselor for a couple of years. I did some other things. I had 2 children, my 2 daughters, Laura and Audrey, wonderful, wonderful young women now, although they would call themselves middle-aged. I wouldn't. I'd call them young. And well, I did that, but I also did some other things. And again, this goes along with the women's empowerment theme. I started a women's consciousness raising group among some people that were connected, faculty wives, as we called ourselves back in those days, the Faculty Wives Club. And that was really eye-opening for me, sharing some of the things and experiences that I had, and also hearing others' experiences. And I formed really close bonds with those folks, and I'm still close with them today. Also formed a book group where we read only women's works. So that was Fort Collins, and it was wonderful. What happened then? Well, it was when we moved to Rochester in 1981 that I was really starting to think, I got to get somewhere with this career. You know, I'm not going to be a high school guidance counselor all of my life. I wasn't quite ready. My kids were still little, like 7 and 3, so I wasn't quite ready. I think people to indulge in my, my fantasies of, total full-time work and being independent career woman kind of thing. So, so what I did was I ended up getting a part-time job at what was very nascent Rochester Women's Network. If people remember, it's still around, but it was a group of working women, strong women, who met together every month to have a speaker and have a lunch and to have other evening programs as well. So I was hired as kind of a jack of all trades to help organize all these events and things. And, it wasn't much of a job as jobs go. It was kind of glorified secretarial work. On the other hand, it was wonderful to be around these women, and they became my mentors and kind of helped steer me in a direction which was going to be much more fruitful for me in terms of my career. So by that time, the kids, I worked there a couple of years, and the kids were in school. I think the youngest was in kindergarten. So it's time. So what I did, really interesting, I think, I tried to combine the counseling degree that I had with the teaching aspect, which I still had such a longing to be more successful, but in a different setting than a school setting. So this became my life when I became a career counselor. Ellie Stauffer will probably recognize this, Women's Career Center. Probably I was maybe a couple years after. I started in 1984, so it was probably a couple years after Ellie. And I built my career there, counseling, training, running workshops, facilitating. So I was teaching, I was also coaching and counseling. So I was combining the 2 master's degrees that I had, and it seemed to be working pretty well. Well, talk about opportunities. This organization, the Women's Career Center, grew and became career development services eventually. I'm working with not just women, but men and companies as well as individuals. And I was able to structure different roles for myself within the organization. I became a road warrior as we ended up working with companies all over the country. You started out working with Kodak, doing some training for their sales force. Word gets around, people started seeing us as an organization that could work with companies all over the country. 3M was one of our major clients, as was Georgia Pacific. So I was on an airplane a lot of the time, and I liked that. Initially, there were some problems, as there always is with kids, being middle school, high school, having traumas, and mom's not there, so that wasn't the greatest. But I love the independence. I love the freedom. I love driving in all these different cities, everywhere from, Philadelphia to San Francisco. And, those were the days when you wore high heels on the airplane. So I just thought, yes, I'm here. I've arrived. Did become a vice president of our corporate side of our business, organizational side of our business eventually. I was there for about 25 years until I retired in 2005. And I retired because my husband, again, here I am trailing now again, had an opportunity for a sabbatical in England. But, he was working for the University of Rochester. I should have mentioned that before. He came to Rochester to work at Xerox, but morphed his career back into academia. And of course, being an English major, this was the best. This was the best year, I think, just about anywhere. We were in a small town called Winchester. Everybody's probably heard the song Winchester Cathedral. He went to Southampton University, and I just flew. I took all kinds of classes. I drove on the wrong side of the road. We had tons of company came that year. I just found it a really enriching experience. We also traveled a lot in Europe and also around England. So that was great. And I was so high from that year. I came back in 2006. And at that point, maybe I'll wait on that because I'm going to talk about my religious background and growing up first. So I'm going to wait on what happened in 2006. But we'll get there. Let's start with religious journey. My parents were both agnostics, but back in those days, of course, couldn't admit that. My mother decided that the Episcopal Church was the place where she would take her daughters on Sunday morning, Sunday school, and to be involved in whatever church activities there were. And I could say, when my friends asked me, well, what's your church? I could say the Episcopal Church. Well, I will say I bought that hook, line, and sinker. I loved my church. The red velvet pew cushions and the kneelers that they had there. The gold crosses, big gold crosses that would be carried by my boyfriends into the church in the processional. Loved that. I loved the stained glass windows, Tiffany windows we had in our church. I don't know how they managed that. So that was a very powerful influence for me. When I got to college, went a few times, kind of grew away from it. I met my husband. He had also been raised as an Episcopalian, and he had also sort of was in the process of growing away. And so we just didn't think about it and didn't go to church at all until our older daughter was about 3 years old. And we decided, we ought to look for some place where we can give our kids some religious background education, good Western art, Western music. There's so much there that they need to know about. So we did. And we went to the local Episcopal church. This was in Colorado. And didn't work out too well. She had fun drawing a picture of Noah's Ark, but we looked at each other after we got out of the church service and said, we don't believe a word of this. So what are we going to do? Well, one of my friends was a Unitarian, and she said, why don't you come to the Unitarian church? That was in Colorado. So I did. It was small. They didn't have an organ. They had a piano, and yeah, I kind of liked what they were saying, but it didn't feel like church to me. It was just in kind of a warehousey looking building, and there wasn't anything there that was grabbing me. The power of the beauty of the Episcopal ritual was still there somewhere in my consciousness, and I just couldn't see doing this. But after we moved to Rochester in '81, I said, well, there's a great big Unitarian church. here. And I don't remember exactly when we went, but it was the first Sunday that they had the big organ transplant. And I came in and I sat down and they started playing these familiar hymns. The words were different, but the swelling of the organ and, you know, obviously the building looked really different from what I was used to as an Episcopalian, but I just loved it from the beginning. It had what I wanted. It had the message and the meaning that I wanted. And it also had the music that was so important to me from my childhood. So that's that story. We brought the kids. Both of them went all the way through everything, you know, about your sexuality, which they don't call it that anymore. I think it's OWL. And they went through religion and life and went to Boston and did all that stuff. And that was great. And during that time, I was head of the RE committee. I worked on Canvas. I did a lot of music. I was in the bell choir for, I don't know, 30 some years. There was a lot going on. The church was very important to me. We had Dick Gilbert at the time was teaching a class called Building Your Own Theology. Some of you may remember that well. And the group that we took that with was a group of youngish couples in their 30s. And there were 6 couples, I think, or 7 couples. And we became very close. And we had monthly dinners. Our kids were all about the same age. Sometimes we did activities with kids. Sometimes it was just us. There was a very, very close group of people. And that was in the 80s into about the mid-90s. And people's marriages fell apart. People moved away. It was a very, it was hard. So as soon as my youngest kid got done with high school and went away and we were empty nesters, I took about, I want to say maybe a 9-year hiatus from church. As I said, our dear friends had, many of them had moved. That was part of it. Part of it was we wanted to travel more. And part of it was, you know, my husband wasn't really didn't feel a part of the church anymore. He had actually taught RE and done some different things. Was on the original, they didn't call it Byfriars, but on the committee to do the property maintenance fund, which some of you may remember. He was involved in that and was also on the board of directors for a small stint. But he got burned out and he said, I'm not going to go anymore. I'm going to do other things on Sunday morning. So I wasn't sure where I was kind of coming down with all that, but that was fun. So now back to 2006, I'm coming back from England, and I had resigned from Career Development Services. So here I was, and I'm thinking, I am not ready to retire. I am bored, let's face it. And so what do? Well, I'm sitting there reading what was the paper bulletin of the church because, you know, I'm still connected. And I see they're advertising for a membership director, part-time. And I looked at it and I looked at the skills that they were looking for. And I said, this is so perfect for me. And I think I'll apply for this job. Well, I did. And I got the job. And I tell you, this was the best job I have ever had. I'm using all my counseling skills. I'm using all my listening skills. I'm using my teaching skills, my skills of connecting different people with different resources, connecting different people with each other, hearing about people's religious journeys when I would teach UU 101 was so rewarding. And it was like hearing about people's career journeys, which I had used to do in my former position. So it was great. And we had a great team that we worked with, a ministerial team. And that's when I first started hearing the idea that what I was doing was a ministry. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms or in those words. So I did kind of think, no, if I look at it that way, it is what I'm called to do. It is what I am called to use my skills to do. And it was very rewarding. And it was a time of great explosion of membership in our church. And not that I attribute that to myself, but I was part of that team where that was going on. I was able to gain some national visibility through workshops that I did locally and then regionally on radical hospitality. And then I moved into actually being able to present at General Assembly in 2011. And it was great. It was a pinnacle for me, and I retired shortly thereafter, primarily because we wanted to go places. My husband wanted to go places on Sundays, weekends, and that was difficult. So it was time for me to go. But the thing that I really am happy about is that I've been able to continue that ministry through the hospitality team that I'm on, and welcoming people in that first phase through the door and helping them understand who we are and helping them get comfortable. So I like that. Occasionally substitute for Shannon in UU 101 when she's got something going on. So that's always fun to go back and do that again. So once I started to think of hospitality as a ministry, that really helped define my role at the church, and I feel good about that. I am involved in. I'm not involved in any of the Soul Matters groups. I have close groups that I've been in for years and years. I have a writing group that I'm in, a book group that I'm in, and the connections that I've formed there over the years seem good and supportive to me. And so I never got into the Soul Matters thing. And for some reason, I started to feel, well, maybe you should do that. But again, I'm feeling that this ministry that I started with as membership director and continuing now with hospitality, also hope to get involved with RAIN. I've done just a very little bit, but who knows what's going to happen when this pandemic is over. So again, I see that as a hospitality ministry as well. So that's my story. When I look back at my tapestry, it's very imperfect. And I see all the strands, and some are very vibrant strands, and some are faded, and some are stretched to the breaking point. Some represent joys, like my grandchildren, and some represent disappointments and heartbreaks. And somewhere between the disappointment and the heartbreak is the fact that I'm losing my vision, which is very hard for somebody who's been a lifelong reader. But there's certainly lots of opportunities for me to use different technologies, which I'm grateful for. So that's my imperfect tapestry. But the good thing about it is I hope it's still a work in progress, and I know I won't ever perfect it, but I can look at it, I can look at the strands, and I can see more clearly now that I'm an elder, since this is Elder Tree, how the strands fit together in a way that I really couldn't when I was younger. So certainly the theme of women and empowering women has been such an important one in my life, and I see that from the very beginning of my mother in the bookmobile, and myself finding me in a place like Wellesley College, home of Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright, and certainly lots of others who aren't as well known. The theme continued, and it does to this day. And women's friendships are really, really an important part of my life, and I hope you all create your own tapestries. I'm sure you have. And, you know, thinking of it in that way as a weaving is pretty meaningful to me. So I'm done. Libby, where are you?